All right, let's keep digesting our food here. We're going to move on down to the stomach. And you do want to make sure you're learning your pathway. I do want you guys to be able to trace a food bolus, which is a wad of food that you're digesting from one end to the other. So if we're thinking about the pathway that food is taking, we're starting in the mouth, your oral cavity. And that's next going to move into the oropharynx, the back of the throat behind the tongue. So that compartment you share in common with the respiratory system. Then it's going to move into the laryngopharynx. You also share that in common between your respiratory and digestive system. Now if you're air, you're going to head down into the larynx and supply the lungs with air. If you're food or water, hopefully you're not going into the larynx because that's going to choke you. So the epiglottis closes when you're swallowing, and that food bolus can enter the esophagus. That's that muscular tube that's posterior to the trachea, and that's going to send it down toward the stomach. Now we're not going to go through, your textbook provides quite a few details on the muscular contractions and so forth that have to take place to facilitate swallowing, and we're going to bypass that information. You contract skeletal muscles to help achieve swallowing. That's probably not a surprise to you. The esophagus is, now unlike the trachea, which is has all these rings of cartilage, and the larynx has cartilage and other connective tissues that give it a very firm consistency, the esophagus is very muscular. You got a lot of smooth muscle in there so that it can do peristalsis to squeeze the food from one end to the other, but it's pretty squishy and thin compared to the trachea. So it's going to extend from the laryngopharynx to the stomach. It has to pass through your diaphragm. That's not a surprise. So it passes through the mediastinum, behind the heart, behind the big blood vessels that are superior to the heart that we were studying during cardiovascular. So it has to pass through the diaphragm. That's called the esophageal hiatus. There is a sphincter, the gastroesophageal sphincter, that opens into the stomach. So a sphincter is a muscular apparatus that can contract to close or relax to open. So you have a sphincter at the junction between the esophagus and the stomach, which allows food to enter, and that's called the gastroesophageal sphincter. Sometimes it's just called the esophageal sphincter. You may see both of those terms. All right, so time out here for a little bit of a homeostatic imbalance. What's happening when you have heartburn? So you have a lot of acid in the stomach, and if some of that acid makes its way in the wrong direction, past the gastroesophageal sphincter and up into the esophagus, that's when you experience heartburn. All right, so you have sensory nervous tissue in the esophagus that detects the acid and generates the signaling that your brain is going to interpret as pain. So as you guys know, you drink too much, eat too much, you're likely to experience heartburn. You overfill your stomach. Some of that stomach acid pushes up through the gastroesophageal sphincter and into the esophagus. Extreme obesity can put pressure on the stomach and cause that. Pregnancy, that's not a surprise. If you got a big old fetus pushing up on your stomach, can squeeze some of that acid up into the esophagus as well. It can also occur sometimes with running also. Now you may have heard before of somebody having a hiatal hernia. What is a hiatal hernia? So we just mentioned over here that there is a feature called the esophageal hiatus. Oops, going the wrong way. That's the opening that the esophagus has to pass through to get past the diaphragm. All right, so if you have a hiatal hernia, part of the stomach is actually extending through that opening, that esophageal hiatus, and up into the thoracic cavity. That's called a hiatal hernia when that happens. That's a structural abnormality. And sometimes there are infants that are born with that condition as well. So that can lead to esophagitis, inflammation of the esophagus. You're going to have a lot of stomach acid, obviously, up in the esophagus, lots of heartburn. The acid of the stomach is going to irritate and damage the inside lining of the esophagus, which is why you're going to have that inflammation there. You could wind up with ulcers, holes in the wall of the esophagus. That would not be too cool because of all that stomach acid damaging it. And then also it could lead to esophageal cancer. You have all this damage going on with the tissues that line the esophagus. That inside lining has to get replaced pretty frequently. So you have lots of mitosis. And cancers typically develop in tissues in your body that are mitotic, tissues that undergo cell division a lot anyway. The more a tissue divides, the more opportunities you have for one of those cells to mutate and become cancerous. So that can trigger esophageal cancers in some cases. All right, the stomach. So we'll be talking about the anatomy of the stomach more so over on the anatomy side, but here's your esophagus here coming in and meeting the stomach. And so your gastroesophageal sphincter is not really shown there, but that's where it's going to be located. And the stomach then extends, has this dome portion that extends upward from there that's called the fundus of the stomach. You can see that you have multiple layers of smooth muscle tissue. There's a longitudinal layer with fibers that run in, smooth muscle fibers that run in one direction. A circular layer where you have fibers that run in a circular direction around the stomach, and an oblique layer where you have fibers that are running on a diagonal. So the stomach is a very muscular organ. The serosa here, that's the outer serous membrane covering the visceral peritoneum that's in contact with the surface of the stomach. That's what that's representing for you. Notice the inside surface of the stomach is very folded. Those are called rugae, R-U-G-A-E. Those are the folds of the inner lining of the stomach. We'll see in the intestinal tract as well, the intestinal lining is also heavily folded. That gives you more surface area for absorption. Now down over here at this other end of the stomach, this is leading to the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. And this area of the stomach is called the pylorus, or the pyloric canal. And you do have a sphincter located right here that can open and close. And that will admit a bolus of food that's in the process of being digested from the stomach and down into the duodenum. So that sphincter or valve that's located there is called the pyloric sphincter. The main part of the stomach, between the fundus and the pylorus, can just be referred to as the body of the stomach. All right, so let's take a look at a little bit more detail microscopically what's happening along our stomach lining. So you do have a mucosa, that mucosal lining, and that is composed of, you have a layer of simple columnar epithelium. And within that mucosal lining, as we'll see on a diagram, you have little indentations that are called gastric pits that are lined with cells that produce the secretions that are going to be present in the gastric juice. Okay, so these are actually, these pits lead to glands, exocrine glands, that secrete gastric juices, which are very acidic, as you guys already know. The mucus cells along the mucosal lining produce a very alkaline mucus. And that might sound counterintuitive to what we were just talking about with the gastric juice, but that mucus stays attached to the inside lining of the stomach along your rugae that you see over here. And it keeps the surface, the immediate surface, at a more neutral pH. So you have the alkaline mucus along the surface. You have the stomach acid that gets squirted into the interior of the stomach, and that mucus helps protect the inside lining of the stomach from damage. Imagine you couldn't expose the actual epithelial tissue lining of the stomach to that low pH of your stomach acid, because it would actually damage those types of cells there. So that's protecting the actual surface of the stomach itself. All right, here is a diagram which is showing you a chunk of the wall of the stomach. So the main business area right in here is the mucosa or the mucosal lining. And if you go deeper from there, like we were looking at on kind of the generic digestive system organ in the first video lecture, you have layers of connective tissue where you have blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, etc. And then outward from there toward the surface of the stomach, that's where you have all those smooth muscle tissue layers of the stomach wall. All right, so this would be, this is a little chunk, this is the actual mucosal lining of the stomach, and then these are those gastric pits I was mentioning a minute ago. So they go down into the wall of the stomach at a microscopic level, and they lead to our gastric glands. So now we're blowing up these gastric pits. So technically the gastric pit is, this is the surface over here, and you would actually see these little holes, little rabbit holes, along the mucosal lining of the stomach, and you go down inside them. First part near the surface, those are called the gastric pits, and then when you get a little deeper, they become the gastric glands, because you have cells in there that are producing different substances that are present in your gastric juice. And you even have some hormone producing cells in there as well, the ones that are colored in green here on the diagram, enteroendocrine cells, entero referring to the digestive tract, and endocrine producing hormones. So those cells are actually producing hormones that play roles in digestion. All right, and then if we blow up one of these gastric glands and look at it in a little bit more detail, there are some important cells in here. The purple ones are called chief cells. The green ones, again, are the enteroendocrine cells. And the blue ones, they look a little scary here in the diagram. Those are called parietal cells. All right, so how about these gastric gland secretions? What's going on? So these, the ones that produce most of your gastric juice they're in the fundus and the body. And the major important ones, those parietal cells, the kind of evil looking blue ones on the diagram, they secrete hydrochloric acid, HCl. So it's an acid. If you guys remember, acids in our body fluids break apart into hydrogen ions and then some other negatively charged ion. Okay, so that's what hydrochloric acid is, a pretty simple acid. It just breaks apart into hydrogen ions, and those are called chloride ions that are negatively charged. All right, so it's an acid. So remember, if you increase the concentration of hydrogen ions that you have in a fluid, what's happening to your pH? It's going down, just like what we were talking about with the respiratory system. So why do we need that acid in there? The pH is very low, 1.5 to 3.5, and that is going to help us break down the foods that have been swallowed into the stomach, preparing them further for more detailed digestion that'll take place in the small intestine. The acids are especially important for denaturing the proteins in our foods. You know, as you guys learn in any biology class, proteins have very specific three-dimensional structures. They're chains of amino acids, but they're folded up in some sort of 3D structure. Denaturing means they lose that 3D structure. So they become more linear and open, and that's going to make them easier to digest, because we need to chop our proteins eventually up into individual amino acids, smaller organic molecules. If those amino acids are all folded up in a 3D structure where you can't access them with the enzymes that are going to chop the protein apart, you're not going to be able to digest those proteins very well. So those acidic conditions help denature these proteins. Hydrochloric acid also activates pepsin. If we were move back to this figure over here. Chief cells in the gastric gland, the ones that are purple, they secrete an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. So there's our O-gen, like angiotensinogen, when we were learning about angiotensin, when we covered blood vessels and blood pressure regulation. These cells secrete an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. The hydrochloric acid produced by the parietal cells lowers the pH, and that activates the pepsinogen. It becomes pepsin. Okay, so this is the active form. And what that does is it digests proteins. Okay, so it starts chopping up proteins into peptides. A peptide, a protein is generally a long chain of amino acids that's folded up into some three-dimensional structure. A peptide is a shorter chain of amino acids. So we haven't completely chopped them up into their little individual amino acid building blocks, but we're starting along those processes. Something else parietal cells make, which we heard about at the very beginning of Unit 2, they secrete a glycoprotein. That's a sugar-protein combination. Different from mucin, though. We talked about mucin being a glycoprotein as well in your saliva and other mucous membrane type secretions. This is important for absorbing vitamin B12 in the small intestine. So it's actually secreted in the stomach. And if you guys remember, there is a type of anemia that occurs when in people who don't produce intrinsic factor, or they don't produce enough intrinsic factor, they can't absorb vitamin B12 properly. Vitamin B12 is needed for cell division. It's needed for making your DNA before a cell divides. So if you can't, like we learned about at the very beginning of Unit 2, if you don't have vitamin B12, you can't do cell division adequately, so you can't crank out new red blood cells as well as you're supposed to. That's called pernicious anemia, just as a review. All right, and again, that pepsinogen, the chief cells in the gastric glands make pepsinogen, which is inactive, and HCl helps convert it to pepsin. And then once you start getting some pepsin around, pepsin actually can convert pepsinogen to more pepsin. So you have kind of a positive feedback mechanism. The more of this you have around, it's going to actually help convert that pepsinogen to even more pepsin. There are gastric lipases as well. So we had lingual lipases produced by the tongue that help start digesting lipids, and then you have gastric lipases, which also help break down lipids as well. These are responsible for digesting about 15% of your lipids. And then I did mention that you have these enteroendocrine cells down at the bottom of those gastric glands, and they produce gastrin. That's a hormone that actually stimulates secretion of these gastric juices. And then there are some other paracrine factors. Remember, paracrine factors are chemical signals that act locally. Gastrin, interestingly enough, if we go backwards here for a second, gastrin is an endocrine hormone. So it's made by these cells, but then it's actually going to go into the bloodstream and travel. It's going to have to circulate through your cardiovascular system, through blood vessels, and then it will act on these other cells in the gastric glands. The blood will actually bring it to them. The capillaries that surround those cells within the walls of the stomach will supply the gastrin to those particular cells, which is kind of interesting to think about. The hormone is made right there in the neighborhood, but it actually has to enter the bloodstream and get circulated through the body and back to those cells that are pretty nearby before it can actually have any effect on them. All right, and I mentioned this mucosal barrier a minute ago. The stomach acid would be very damaging to the lining of the stomach itself, that mucosal lining, if you did not have some sort of barrier to that damage. So you do have a bicarbonate rich mucus that is sitting there right along those rugae, the folds along the inside lining of the stomach. Bicarbonate is a base, so it helps raise pH, so it helps counteract the effects of the stomach acid. You also, the epithelial cells that are right along the stomach lining have lots of tight junctions between them. Tight junctions are like cell snaps that hold the cells together very tightly, because you don't want that gastric juice seeping through those epithelial cells and into the wall of the stomach itself, because if that happens, then you're going to wind up with damage. And if it gets bad enough, it'll lead to an ulcer forming along the wall of the stomach itself. Even with this protection, the epithelial cells that line your stomach do get damaged fairly frequently, and they have to be replaced pretty often. So you have stem cells, unspecialized cells that have not been committed to becoming any particular type of cell yet, and those stem cells will divide and convert themselves into these epithelial cells along the stomach lining to help replace those when needed. All right, so some homeostatic imbalances. If you have gastritis, you have inflammation that's being caused by something that has made its way through that mucosal barrier and is causing problems with your stomach wall. Now, usually when you have, a lot of times when you have a stomach ache, or I've got the stomach flu, which is not really caused by the flu virus, but is usually caused by another type of virus or some type of bacterium. Usually those things are actually going on in your intestinal tract, even though we say they're happening in our stomach. But you can have actual inflammation along the stomach lining, and if you do, that's called gastritis. Ulcers, these are called ulcers where you actually have a sore or an indentation in the wall of the stomach. Those are called peptic or gastric ulcers. You actually have an erosion of the stomach wall, and if they get bad enough, they can go all the way through the stomach wall. Then you have an opening from the inside lining of the stomach all the way to the peritoneal cavity, and that can lead to peritonitis. Peritonitis is inflammation of the peritoneum, serous membrane, so that would not be a good thing. You can also have hemorrhaging that goes on, bleeding occurring from the stomach ulcer as well. Most stomach ulcers are now known to be caused by a type of bacteria called should not be helico, sorry. Should be Heliobacter without the C. Heliobacter pylori, H. pylori, believe it or not, is a type of bacteria that can actually live along the inside lining of the stomach. Most microorganisms do not live there. We have tons of bacteria in the intestinal tract, but not so much in your stomach as far as we know. But this particular type of bacteria can survive in the stomach conditions. And probably a lot of us have that bacteria in our stomach all the time. But in some people, the immune system starts attacking the bacteria and it causes inflammation, and that can eventually lead to an ulcer. Other ulcers have been associated with non-steroid anti-inflammatory type drugs, or NSAIDs, so you have to be careful about taking those types of medications for a prolonged period of time, because they apparently can lead to ulcers forming. All right, so digestive processes in the stomach. What's the stomach doing for us? It's helping with mechanical breakdown, the combination of the food with the acids, and the churning of the stomach helps slosh the food around and denaturing the proteins, breaking things apart so that they're going to wind up being digested more easily once they head down into the small intestine. Then you do have some partial digestion of proteins by the pepsin that the stomach produces. Infants produce a protein called renin, which also helps to digest the proteins that are present in breast milk. All right, and again, your stomach is not completely breaking these proteins down. You're going to polypeptides or peptides, which are chains of amino acids, but they're not super long chains of amino acids. And polypeptides are longer than peptides. If you just see the word peptide, that's going to be a fairly short chain of amino acids, whereas a polypeptide will be a more of a moderate length chain of amino acids. So in the stomach, that pepsin is starting to chop those proteins apart. All right, so the stomach that is combined with the pepsin and the hydrochloric acid and has been sloshed around in the stomach, churning back and forth, becomes a substance called chyme. So this is the output of the stomach. And that chyme is going to pass through the pyloric sphincter and into the duodenum. All right, this is a diagram which is showing you from your textbook, which is showing you some of the different muscular contractions that can take place within the stomach to help out with these digestive processes. You do have propulsion. That's peristalsis, where you're contracting here, then contracting down here, kind of like squeezing a tube of toothpaste to move the chyme that is being produced in the stomach forward. And grinding, you have those three layers, muscular layers in the wall of the stomach, so you can contract in different directions in the stomach, and that creates a grinding type process that sloshes the stomach contents around, mixes them with the pepsin and the hydrochloric acid. And there's a third type of event that can occur called retropulsion. So when the pyloric valve or sphincter opens, it's just going to let a little bit of chyme at a time down into the duodenum. This is the duodenum over here. You don't want like a big old gigantic wad of chyme flooding the duodenum every time the pyloric sphincter opens, because that would overwhelm the duodenum and the processes it's supposed to perform. So you just let a little bit in there at a time, and as it opens up, the muscular wall of the stomach contracts in such a way to push the rest of the stomach contents back in that direction. That's called retropulsion. All right, so as chyme moves down into the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, we're finally in the small intestine where most of our digestive and absorption processes are going to take place. So for lecture number 4, we're going to focus more on what's going on with the small intestine. We are going to have to take some detours, though, off to the liver and over to the pancreas because they produce substances that are important for the function of the small intestine. So we're going to talk about those organs as well as we move through the next few video lectures here on the digestive system.